Hi, it's Nate Charles, and welcome back to the Rule of Law Brief. Quite a lot has happened since I last published a video, and none of it's good. There is probable cause at this point to believe that the president is willing to send Americans to their deaths for his own personal political gain, to distract the American public from his personal foibles in the Epstein files. And we know this because none of the president's stated reasons for bombing Iran make any strategic or legal sense. And when every public explanation collapses under scrutiny, the only reasonable conclusion is that the real reason has not been disclosed. Let's start with these claims about self-defense. Self-defense requires imminence, a specific near-term threat, a clear operational predicate. That doesn't exist here at all. Instead, the president has pointed to generalized hostility, long simmering tensions with Iran going back to Operation Ajax in the 1950s. That is not an imminent threat. He's pointed to long-term missile development, historical grievances, and abstract future danger. That is not an imminent threat. And without an imminent threat, those pretexts for going to war simply don't hold water. And even more importantly, these operations were illegal under international law. Then Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth started talking about deterrence. But deterrence requires a credible escalation dominance. In no way do you build long-term deterrence by publicly announcing that you're not going to put boots on the ground and that you will not sustain institutional transformation. All you're signaling is that the other side needs to absorb the initial blows and wait it out in a bunker, and they'll be fine. That's not deterrence in any way, shape, or form. Then we were told both that it wasn't about regime change and then that it was about regime change, and now we're back to not regime change again. No, it's not about regime change. A decapitation strike without a firm, strategically defined follow-up plan to restructure governing institutions is not regime change in any meaningful sense. Regime change requires institutional dismantling. It requires security sector reconstruction. It requires long-term political supervision. It requires boots on the ground. None of that has happened. Simply killing a leader does no more than test the succession plan for that country and the institutions that are already in place. And in fact, it might even strengthen them by showing that those institutions can survive the death of one particular leader. So no, it's not about regime change. Nor is it about nation building, because as we've said, nation building doesn't exist unless you're willing to put boots on the ground to engage in long-term interaction with those agencies and institutions to ensure that a better form of government takes the place of the one that you just removed. So what is it about? All we can say is it is an offensive military operation without a clearly defined objective or a coherent end state. And here's the critical point. When the administration's explanations are self-contradictory, when the legal theory keeps shifting, when the strategic logic does not match the operational design in any way, shape, or form, and when the outcomes predicted by the rhetoric are structurally impossible under the methods that were chosen, the publicly stated reasons are not the real reasons. These strikes, which were illegal under international law, and for that matter, illegal under the Domestic War Powers Act, were not about imminent self-defense. They were not about institutional regime change. They were not about sustained deterrence, which means that the explanation being offered to the American people is incomplete. When Americans are being sent to die without a complete explanation, it is not cynical to ask why. It is necessary and proper. The war powers demand transparency because they involve irreversible consequences. If the rationale collapses logically, then the burden shifts to the executive branch. Explain the strategy, explain the legal authority, explain the desired end state, explain why this offensive action changes anything in a durable way when it comes to foreign policy or the national security of the United States. Until that burden is met, the reasonable inference is not that the president is a mastermind. The reasonable inference is that the explanation given is not the whole story. And when the explanation is not the whole story in matters of war, Congress has an unequivocal duty to intervene. Because offensive military action without coherent strategy is not strength. It is instability. And even worse, military operations designed to distract from the fact that the president is a pedophile are beyond the pale, both legally and morally. Instability at the level of executive war powers isn't just a foreign policy problem, it is a constitutional one. And it's time to impeach everyone who is standing in the way of resolving that constitutional problem.